Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to be collaborating again with our friends at NYRB and to welcome translator Charlotte Mandell here to read from and discuss her new translation of André Breton and Philippe Soupault's The Magnetic Fields in conversation with NYRB Poets editor Edwin Frank. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days. And I want to give a huge thanks to Charlotte and Edwin for joining us this evening. So to a little bit of housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will try to get through as many of those as we can towards the end of the program. There's also a chat button down here where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book from our store. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that could arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And finally, our event series will continue through the fall and into the winter, so head over to our website to find out what's coming up. One program that I do want to point out happening tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. We're continuing our NYRB Classic series with a discussion of Susan Taubes' modernist masterpiece, Divorcing, with Jess Bergman, David Reef, and Ethan Taubes. We're taking registrations for that event now, and I'll be posting a link to the event page in our chat. So now a little about our presenters, and we will get started. Charlotte has translated nearly 50 books from the French, including works by Guy de Maupassant, Marcel Proust, Maurice Blanchot, Jonathan Little, and Matthias Enard. She has been awarded a translation prize from the Modern Language Association and the National Translation Award in Prose. And Edwin is the founder and editor of the NYRB Classic series and the author of a book of poems, Snake Train. So Charlotte and Edwin, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Hal. It's good to be back doing another event with Community Bookstore. We're really very grateful to Community Bookstore for doing all these events with NYRB Classics, as we're grateful to you all for attending this Zoom event, this virtual gathering. And thank you, Charlotte, for your wonderful translation of The Magnetic Fields, and also for also being here at this event. A few words about The Magnetic Fields and André Breton and Philippe Soupault, its authors. The Magnetic Fields, well, so Breton and Soupault were very young men when The Magnetic Fields was written in 1919, and both 25 and 24, or maybe 24 and 23. And Breton, who in some sense was the moving force, though not necessarily the biggest contributor to the book as it emerged, was a young man from who was training to be a doctor, who had been shocked by what he had seen as a doctor, a military intern in the war, who in 1919, who was also an ambitious young literary man from a not very literary background. His father was a policeman in the provinces, and who at the beginning of 1919 had suffered two major blows. One was that the poet Apollinaire, who had been sort of a mentor of his, as he had also been a mentor to Soupault, and who in fact introduced Soupault and Breton, had died of the Spanish flu. And the other was that this friend of Breton's, or not really a friend, somebody he looked up to, a young man named Jacques Vacher, who was sort of, in Breton's view, the perfect outsider, which Breton himself kind of wanted to be. He was an outsider, sociologically, if you will, from the literary world he wanted to get on in, but he really did want to get on in the literary world, whereas Vacher was completely contemptuous of such things, a kind of dandy, a cynic, a nihilist of sorts. Vacher had killed himself at the beginning of the year. So the immediate background of this book is, in Breton's case, a mixture of ambition, frustration, and really deep grief. He'd been introduced, as I said, by Apollinaire to Soupault, and they got together in the spring of 1919, and they decided to undertake an experiment. Breton had been very interested in Freud, and unusually so in France, where Freud I think was not much attended to, and especially to Freud's free association. And so the idea was to basically get together and write, to free associate on the page. How would they do that? They met for a few weeks and discussed and read science and scientific texts and so on, discussed how they would do it. Then they they decided for a week, they would sit down in the morning and they would write in dead heat, and they would not think about what they were writing, and they would review it in the evening, but they wouldn't revise anything in theory. Wasn't quite how it worked. And then after the end of a week, they would be done. And what they had written would be the book. What they had written would be the book. And they pretty much did that, though there was some touching up later. The book came out about a year later. It was published in 100 years ago, really, basically, September of 1920, in 1920, I believe. The experience was transforming, I think, for both men, but especially for Breton. In the course of it, it was both therapeutic and exhilarating. It was also terrifying. He began to think that the things he was writing, he would see happening around him. He felt that he could not go on for a day more than that they had been doing. So in a way, even if it was therapeutic for the sorrow that had come before, it was in another way a kind of renewed trauma. Several years later, when Breton and Soupault and their good friend Louis Aragon had all split from Dada, which was the latest thing when the magnetic fields came out, they declared that this was the seed of surrealism, and that was something that Breton, in his many years as the head of school of surrealism, continued to insist on. It's certainly a text like no other text before it, though it has some echoes of things. And Charlotte, why don't you read us a section, and we'll go on to talk and read some more and so on. But that, to give people a sense of what it feels like.
Yeah. So I think I'm just going to start by reading a very short section from Let's Stop Moving. It's on page, if you have the book, it's on page 55. This is just sort of to give you an idea of how it sounds in English. The nocturnes of dead musicians lull cities forever asleep. On the steps of a hotel on 30th Avenue, a baby and a puppy frolic. No, you cannot form an idea of aquatic customs by looking through your tears. That is not true. Space, smooth as a woman's hand, belongs to speed. From day to day, we come closer to scrublands and markets. The depth of Leal is less than that of the Pacific Ocean. Thick, well-thumbed books turn into abandoned shells full of earth. On the agate ramps and the moving walkways, we notice little chalk stars that have never signified anything but the nostalgia of upholsterers and sailors. Antiquity is a fountain, pearly in spots, but the throats of sphinxes have turned green. The slanting hail of prisons, that wonderful bunch of keys, keeps us from seeing the sun. A female dancer on the tightrope is our fickle patience. Sheltered from posthumous insults, we miss the love of all women. We reread the barometric clues at every garden entrance. Hotels. At midnight, you will again see the open windows and closed doors. Music emerges from all the holes where you can see microbes and capitalized lines of poetry dying like worms. But farther on, still farther on, there are more cries so blue you die of excitement. Everything is blue here. The avenues and grand boulevards are deserted. The night is overcrowded with stars, and the song of those folk rises to the sky just as the sea goes off in search of the moon, a happiness so heavy and so undisappointing for the delicate souls of the waves. The beaches are full of those bodiless eyes you meet near dunes, and remote meadows red from the blood of flowery flocks. Corpses of beloved days, crater of emotions, and red drunkennesses, but where the heart beats like a thin bell turned pale by external suns. The main door lets orange smoke seep through like the mushrooms we used to love. The wood is quite close, and rotund women run here and there, gathering ephemeral leaves brought back to life. They are birds of every color that sing better than the wind. Quadrilateral, where you suffocate forever, but when you leave, you know the hunter is there with all those dogs, all those eyes, and no one can forget the fucking church clock that hits you on the head like a rock that disintegrates without a cry. My two crossed hands represent the celestial vault, and my head is a grotesque bald goose. The operator, in order to photograph certain plants, is obliged to hold a fan and must pretend to be dancing. The spectacle of alpine variations, the leitmotif of the chamois, the luxurious hotel, and the lace crevasses delight people of a mediocre sort. Street singers, the world is big and you will never succeed. You feel it's there, the monstrous barometer, the gaslight liar of waiting rooms. So I thought maybe I'd just stop there and we could talk a little bit about what it was like translating it.
Well, I was thinking, I mean, it seems a great selection for sort of showing well, a number of things that crop up throughout the poem, like the background scenery of avenues, hotels, in a kind of way. In a way, it's a scenery not that different from Eliot's The Waste Land. But there also, I was noticing, the language is I think especially dense in French and must have presented a real challenge. And I noticed, for example, one of the phrases "dying like worms" comes up. I mean, worms, and it functions as a pun, right, in French, in that worms are vers. Well, how did you handle things like that? The wordplay that.
That was the hardest thing, was trying to keep the sort of interesting wordplay. I wanted to stay as close to the imagery as possible because it's so full of images. The whole text is just so imagistic, and I wanted to sometimes, like in the case of vers, which can mean either a line of poetry or it can mean a worm. In French, that comes through very easily, but in English, I would have to sort of add the worms. But I tried to there were some cases where I had to sort of be a little bit more literal than I would usually be in order to keep the images. I was trying to stay as, I guess as literal as possible whenever I could, just so that the images would come through. And I would also sort of try to keep the syntax the same so that the word order would be similar to the word order in French. So I guess that was the main thing, but also I was also trying just to do what they did, which was to sort of take dictation from the mind. So I actually was trying not to think very much as I was translating it. I mean, I was also working very quickly, and because I knew that they worked fast, and also that it should come directly from the subconscious. So that was one of my goals, was just to work as fast as I could and not to think, and to just try to sort of take dictation from the subconscious. Which was difficult because then if there was a mistake or something, then I would have to decide, well, should I fix that? Or, I mean, sometimes it sounded better. But yeah, I would try to fix the mistakes.
And also give yourself room to give yourself latitude as well as being literal in a way.
Yeah. And it was very easy to sort of get carried away by the text. And it was actually a really pleasurable experience when I was translating. I mean, it was very intense, and I could see how they could really get carried away, especially I guess near the end. I think they had to stop because they felt like they were losing their mind. And I could sort of feel that at the end. It was becoming very disjointed and abstract. And that was actually the most difficult part to translate, were the poems at the end.
At the end, yeah. Yeah, which are much more splintered in a way. Well, we'll get to that. It's curious because it presents a problem. I mean, again, this was something, what they were doing was not unheard of. People had given dictations of various sorts over, and Victor Hugo, I think, who also in some sense did some early abstract paintings, had been interested in this almost oracular role of the poet. So there was a bit of a tradition, but the way in which they just sat down to totally focus on it and focus on nothing else but this was in a way new. And you do feel, as you read through the book, the first point, I mean, part of what you just read, which is sort of midway through the book, has this we. And the whole first section is all about what we run down the avenues, we pursue this. It's sort of the voice of a generation. In a way, it has a certain almost, they haven't been able to shake loose the notion of addressing people. But there are all sorts of different forms of address in this. There's a sort of detective novel buried in one of the things, and a man, somebody who's flying. There's one of the sections which has almost a major character, the traveler, who goes from place to place, and though the places they go are not predetermined in the way that you would feel. How did you balance those different kinds of rhetorics? I mean, you must have been, because there's a scientific rhetoric in the book as well, and or I was noticing that zoological imagery. It's also humor too, and sort of like a grotesque, like a bald goose.
There is a lot of humor, yeah. There's also a sort of feeling of like the end of the world, especially in the beginning, which I think resonates a lot right now. Like it seems like a good time for this to come out, because it has that same sort of end of the world feeling. Like it's like two young men who are wandering around the city that feels like they've just had this horrible war and they're traumatized by all of these deaths. And it's a sort of similar feeling right now, I guess, of this end of the world feeling. When I was translating it, I just tried to immerse myself as much as I could in the text. So as I was translating it, I actually didn't read any biographical material about the piece or about them or anything. I just tried to, and actually that's sort of the way I work usually. I don't read a book before I translate it. And actually I started translating this as a favor to a friend who he wanted to read it, and so I just thought I would just do the first chapter. But then I just sort of got hooked by this. I mean, I had read it a long time ago, but I didn't remember it very well. So I wanted to find out what was happening next. So I just kept on doing it, and that's how I sort of finished the whole book. But it was a very immersive experience. I mean, it was very intense, and yeah, I guess I can't really say how I did it, except just that I tried to channel it somehow.
Well, I mean, they were always very clear that it was in some sense a response to the war, and then the book is finally dedicated to Jacques Vacher, so that and of course, as I said, Apollinaire died in the Spanish flu, so they had actually been through the previous pandemic comparable to this one, really. So
yeah,
in that sense, it really is quite timely, and it's on its 100th anniversary. Why don't you read another chunk?
Yeah. So let's see. I'll read just the section that comes after that one, called White Gloves, which is on page 67. The hallways of the grand hotels are deserted, and the cigar smoke is hiding. A man walks down the steps of sleep and notices that it is raining. The window panes are white. We know that a dog rests near him. All obstacles are present. There is a pink teacup, an order given, and unhurriedly the servants go round. The great curtains of the sky open. A buzzing hum accentuates this hurried departure. Who can run so quietly? Names lose their faces. The street is nothing but a deserted road. Around 4 o'clock on that day, a very tall man was passing over the bridge that links the various islands. The bells or the trees were ringing. He thought he could hear the voices of his friends. The office of lazy excursions is on the right, they were shouting to him, and Saturday the painter will write to you. The neighbors of the solitudes were leaning out, and all night one could hear the whistling of the streetlights. The capricious house is losing its blood. We love all fires. When the color of the sky changes, it's a dead man passing. What better thing can one hope for? Another man in front of a perfumer's shop was listening to distant drum rolls. The night that was soaring above his head came to perch on his shoulders. Conformist fans were for sale. They weren't producing any more fruit. Without knowing the results, people were running toward maritime openings. Desperate clocks were counting out a rosary. Virtuous beehives were organizing themselves. No one passed near those grand avenues that are the strength of cities. A single storm sufficed. Very far away or very nearby, the damp beauty of prisons went unrecognized. The best refuges are train stations, since travelers never know which way to go. One could read in the lines of the palms that the tokens of the most fragrant faithfulness are without a future. What can we do with muscular children? The hot blood of bees is preserved in mineral water bottles. Never have we seen the sincerities discovered. Well-known men lose their lives in the insouciance of those beautiful houses that set hearts beating. How small these rescued tides look. Earthly delights flow freely. Each object serves as a paradise. A grand bronze boulevard is the most direct path. Magic squares are not good resting places. The slow, sure step. After a few hours, one perceives the pretty nosebleed plant. The panorama of consumptives lights up. You can hear all the footsteps of underground travelers, but the most ordinary silence reigns in these narrow places. A traveler stops, thirsty. Amazed, he approaches this colorful plant. No doubt he wants to pluck it, but he can only shake the hand of another traveler covered in hidden jewels. Their eyes exchange sulfur flames, and for a long time they talk about their wonderful cries. You think you hear a murmuring of a dry moon, but a glance dissipates the most prodigious meetings. No one could recognize those travelers of pale stock. The twilights of suburbs and the sadness of fairground festivities separated them. The weather is so beautiful under the tent. A sky blue vapor seeped through the outskirts of the clearing, and the miraculous plant was slowly growing. At the militant extremities, long appeals made shrubs tremble. There were ocean liners that for many years were leaving the island of adorations. Emigrants were already calculating and no longer ignored sentimental combinations. The surrounding forest became emptied of its inhabitants. Animals in their dens were looking at their little ones. The clouds were disappearing quickly, letting the stars die. Night ran dry. A carefree traveler says to his companion, "I have walked in front of myself and I have understood the fatality of perpetual running and solitary orgies. On my right, I killed a friend who knew nothing but the sun. Its rays were spattering us painfully, and I was so thirsty that I drank his sufferings. He was still laughing while he confided his final sigh to me. I couldn't help but grind my teeth while I read in his eyes the passionate resignation of suicides. The wind brought a lump to my throat, and I couldn't tell who was still speaking to me. I recognized you." The dark silence of metals fed on their words. The traveler whose hands were jeweled replied, "The best 3 days of my life left a pale heart in my chest. The odious flavors of Eastern countries construct nightmares. I remember a man who ran without seeing his hands. Today I see you again."
I thought that when I was reading the book today, I was particularly struck by that passage. So I'm glad that you read it. And then I was looking up in the French edition, in the Pléiade, the fancy French edition with all the annotations, where you can find out who wrote what in the which when Breton first, shortly after they did it, read it to his other buddy, Aragon. Breton read it and was very annoyed that Aragon said, "Well, of course, this is by you and this is by Soupault." But in fact, actually, there is a great consistency on the whole. But that whole section that you just read is all Soupault. And then immediately after that, when it goes on about something about months beginning with R, here we are, and they had reached the months beginning with R, and so here we are, as it were. And that begins a Breton section. So it has, it's funny that sort of felt consistency of that with this sort of double recognition is all one person, except that it's also all about the subject of the poem, which is this peculiar relationship between these two men who are in a way kind of trying to meld, starting what's the name of the first section? You translated it as the two-way window.
The two-way mirror.
Two-way mirror, yeah. Or the mirror without a backing, right, is another way, literally in the French, right? But it's as if the two men were sort of looking at each other back and forth, and I think it was your idea that we should put the portraits, the Picabia portraits of them in the front pages, so that you have almost, you know, the one young man looking at the other young man who isn't just like him, but is sort of like him because Picabia makes them. But did you have times when you felt that, you know, you knew this was one or the other of the writers, or did you feel the
I thought the part that I just read, at first I thought it was Breton, because I thought that was the man who was dead was Jacques Faché, I was thinking. But no, I actually didn't know who was who. And I kind of like not knowing that. And I think actually the whole interest of the automatic writing is to have two people doing it is, I mean, I think you can't really be truly automatic unless you have more than one person writing, so that because you start to follow a sort of certain logic if you're writing by yourself, and then having another person contributes to that, or can break the logic. I mean, it can make it, you know, really surreal. Where I think if it were just one I think that's probably why Breton wanted somebody else to help him write this, because he knew that it would make too much sense if he just did it himself.
Well, I mean, nowadays, everybody's been told, you know, whether by a writing class teacher or a shrink, to practice automatic writing at some point and see what it's. I mean, the novelty of doing it, and the curious way. I mean, I guess it is true whenever at least when I try to do automatic writing, the question of whether one's being truly automatic is always sort of haunting you. So it's more sort of becomes kind of super self-conscious writing, which is actually which is the least automatic writing.
Yeah.
Whereas there is, I think you're right about, you know, bringing in somebody else. I wonder, did each of them sort of think of the other one looking over his shoulder and think, I'm not being free enough, I need to be more like I don't think there's a record of it particularly, but I think they were very conscious of themselves as involving something that also we take for granted now, which is the notion of experimental writing as a sort of given, as certain kinds of imagery in these poems may seem, you know, sort of the kind of, you know, weird zoomorphic imagery and so on now may seem familiar surrealist stuff, but that was all in a way to come. It was all unfamiliar at this point. They were, and I think something you captured really wonderfully in it is that at a certain point, at first they're sort of playing off rhetorics and forms of address and different kinds of storytelling and interrupting and sort of tripping over their own feet. But at a certain point, they begin to write sentences that just aren't like any sentences that anybody had written before. So the energy becomes not precisely that of weird things happening, but just of things, and they must have thought of it partly in terms of sort of cubism, but for example, I think it's like page 25, you suddenly have a sentence set off, cathedral sweat superior vertebrate. And it's just there in the middle of empty space, really. And you know, what's a noun and what's a verb? None of that is particularly clear. It's as if they've almost just entered into sort of weird linguistic stuff. Then they also love to do lists, and this one I can't resist because it's, I mean, this is not a new kind of sentence, but it's one of their moments of humor. There were the grave chants of sickly altars of repose, the prayers of merchants, the anguishes of pigs, the eternal agonies of bookstore owners. But did you have a sense of that sort of experimental side of it? I mean, you clearly tried, yeah.
Definitely, yeah, yeah. Especially nearing the end when the verse becomes very abstract, and that was, I think, the hardest part to translate, was since there was no context. It was just sort of lots of words following each other.
Yeah. We were talking before about how the French word for experimental is not as one might imagine. One might imagine it to be a bit more or less the same word given the Latin, but it's actually quite different. And though we don't know that they sat down, and we know that Breton particularly wanted to wield scientific writing against poetic writing, in a way poetic writing against scientific writing, and that's all through it. But anyway, it was interesting to say about what the word for experiment is in French, because I was asking you that.
Yeah, well, I mean, expérience is an experience and an experiment both, and so and you have to just tell from the context which, if it's an experiment or if it's an experience. And when I was translating it, it felt very much like that. I mean, it was definitely an experience translating it. I mean, it was sort of the experience became the experiment.
Well, it's one of the experiments that, again, since I did, unlike you, I went back to read all these backgrounds, and it is sort of, I'm not sure I like knowing who wrote what. And indeed, there's a good deal of uncertainty about who wrote certain things and when it got interpolated and things like that. But one of the things that they did at a certain point in order to loosen up and write was to write at ever greater speeds. So, and Breton spoke of writing at velocity to the first power, velocity to the second power, velocity to the third power. Interestingly, apparently the manuscript evidence shows that Breton's handwriting never has spelling mistakes and always has perfectly tidy orthography, whereas, Soupault goes all over the place, which actually, again, shows that, I mean, in a curious way, I guess these guys were in a curious way, it's a sort of weird marriage to of opposites in order to put together. But one section towards the middle of the book, which is from the beginning aware of this doubleness, it plays out throughout the book. There's almost a plot to the book in a way. And so there is a section called Barriers, which was written where each like playing ping pong, where each sort of socked the ball back, but it's supposed to be a dialogue. So we thought we would, you want to start at the beginning?
Sure, yeah. Do not forget, gentlemen, that you are not the masters. There are distances to keep. I send you my warmest greetings.
I prefer these beautiful shops where the cashier sits enthroned. You can barely believe your eyes. But since you prefer it, pass by on the sidewalk opposite. Will embarrass you less.
The return to principles implies a very beautiful soul that we do not have. That takes place only in the presence of policemen.
Have you forgotten that the police are neutral and that they have never been able to arrest the sun?
No, thanks, I have the time. Have you been locked up in this cage a long time? The address of your tailor is what I need.
A piece of good advice. Go to the Avenue du Bois and offer a small 10-sou coin to one of the lodgers in those buildings. Delicious bad taste exalts our passions.
Then we can force the retreat of the dead generals and deliver to them again the battles they lost. Failing that, we'll have to lodge a challenge against the fairest judgments in the world, and the law courts are implicated.
I'm not as sure of that as you. The street like I like hinted to me that generals and nuns know how to appreciate the loss of the smallest dreams.
It's quite nice on this side of your voice, but I assure you that you should beware of those distances I was talking about.
What does distance matter? I remember that the journey at the feet of the captain and that handsome black man who smiled at us near the establishment. In that country, there was still the dear child whom your girlfriend was mourning. We followed him. His hands were eaten away by some sort of parasite.
He was another sower of disorder. Memories are full of those somber survivors who were returning from ancient civilizations and were secretly watching each other in waters they had taken care to disturb.
Rivers are not mirrors. We've done much better in the last 10 years. With a stone, I can break all the looking glasses in the city where we live. And insects, smaller than an infant's cries, voluptuously hollow out the foundations of skyscrapers.
No doubt, but we are not yet witnessing the central pillages. You are wrong to believe that our voices serve to fill significant spaces. It's not a very long time since we were born.
Alas, a family friend gave me a jellyfish, and to prevent this respectable animal from experiencing hunger, a green liqueur that contained copper water. The invertebrate wasted away before our very eyes, and when 2 days after its death we cleaned the bowl, we had the joy of discovering a mauve shell that was called chalcedony.
That was commonplace. I myself could tell you the improvement that followed the visit of the President of the Republic. An official clock that struck the hour for restorations was born from a ring of keys he had placed under glass.
I think we could probably stop there. There are certain things that recur throughout, like shells. Did you become conscious of these of the recurrent imagery that just sort of that spreads its tentacles, as it were?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and jellyfish and weird sort of invertebrate animals appear with pedunculate eyes.
Well, what does pedunculate mean? There's some distinctly scientific terminology in there.
I was picturing like googly, like lobster eyes.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, it's very much imagery of the modern world, but but there's also all this sort of zoological imagery that courses throughout it. I think, as I said, I became aware rereading it of the shape of the book with this introduction of the two different writers, or the mirror, where the mirror that's a window, and then the barriers in the middle, the traveler section that I mentioned, and then what you read from White Gloves that also has the traveler, who I think is actually a Vacher figure in the book. But I think, is it White Gloves or anyway, before one gets to the poems, there's a chapter, and it's a way that it's a prose poem when there's certain echoes of Lautréamont and Rimbaud in it, but where, favorite surrealist thing, they're looking at mannequins in a shop window and lobster claws come out and nip at the reflections in the windows. And then you get this final section where the poem book writing experiment turns to verse. I mean, I get and two sections. So this doubling that's been going on all through, called, what's it called? What the
hermit crab says, I think.
Crab says. So it says, so there's one section called that and another section. So as with everything else, it's not clear what it said, whether it was this one or whether it was that one. Mm-hmm. So you said that those were amongst the trickiest parts to translate. And they're almost, what you were saying, it's sort of end of the world. There's something, all the imagery you see before is there, but they're also kind of like chants in a way at the end, almost as if, but why don't you read us some of those?
Yeah, I'll just read a couple of them, just to give you an idea of how different the voice is. So the first one is on page 78. It's called Tempest in a Teacup. Seafood wholesaler, friend of serious behavior, follow me carefully. I have more than one trick up my sleeve. With green, well-trained transparencies, we have no idea of these calorie meters, which give their scope to our desires, where beautiful sentimentalities have a conversation at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I fear seasickness, unbearable ore of the apprentice, experiment of our lives measured by the number of heartbeats. It's a very long stream, thanks to the complicity of nosegays animated by music. And then detour through the sky. Child weaves a despair of pearls, is inspired by the boxes he received for his first communion, poses to himself the problem of birth in the form of a neat equation in the key of C, barricades his windows with his eyelashes, plays with his little sister's prayer, which is more silvery than his, endures mistreatment from 2 to 3, multiplies himself like the microbes in his book, especially by scissiparity, the one that separates from him has wings. He thinks how beautiful karyokinesis is, during Mass.
I had meant to look up karyokinesis, which I haven't. So do you remember what it means? I guess you may well have forgotten it, but I don't.
I think it's when a cell divides. Is that right? What, karyokinesis? When a cell divides, something like that? Karyokinesis.
Which
I'm asking Robert. Karyokinesis? I think it's, yeah. Karyokinesis.
Kinesis would be energy, so karyo is cell.
I think it's a cell dividing, something like that.
And scissoparity, and which again is part of the that thematics of the two, in a way, of the two writers. I mean, I hadn't actually thought of it. The whole thing is being kind of like a sort of first formation of life and a splitting cell, but dividing, which I imagine they were thinking that was. I mean, it was a thought that came to them as this poem came to them in a way that.
I'm butting in for a second just to say it's the division of a cell nucleus during mitosis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hal. You were saying earlier that there's this end of the world element to it, and I certainly found myself thinking that one antecedent, maybe very almost repressed in it, was the revelation of St. John, that it is an apocalyptic work as well. I mean, it's not only as well as prophetic in some way, it's comic, parodic, it's all but there is a kind of an effort to declare an end to one world, and it's not clear whether the beginning of another, though I guess if we have the mitosis in these poems, in a way it is perhaps a new life, a kind of new creation that is being envisioned by the end of it. I mean, it's actually pretty extraordinary how consistent in a way this poem is, and it's sort of working out of themes and how really oracular. Anyway, the last chapter is called and The End of Everything, which also functions in a double way as sort of, it's just a sentence, as if it were the end of like the end at the end of a movie, or the end of the Beatles' Abbey Road with the end of things, and then Her Majesty's a Pretty Nice Girl. But after that follows this great visual, which I don't know whether we could see, which is a business card, André Breton, and as you can all read it. And that is the end of the book. As if they were mere working men, or what do you think is going on in that particular?
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't guess. I think it came out backwards, but it said André Breton, Philippe, Soupault, wood and coal.
But as if they were simply porters in a way, right? Or deliverers of some kind of, I mean, it's an interesting, absolutely flat way. And of course it's a way of stamping their doubleness. I've always loved that ending of and just with the business card, which, and I guess a visual image too. But we can turn to questions. How?
Sorry, I was having computer problems. Great, we have a nice amount of questions. Let's just start from the top. Charlotte, how did translating automatic writing differ in any way from other translations you've made from the French? Was there any discernible new challenge? And I know you did answer some of this already, so I guess the approach for this would be, was there something just on its face the moment that you started that was new for you?
I think I was trying more than usual not to think. Usually I think a lot when I translate. I always don't read ahead, so that was the same. I mean, I didn't read anything ahead as I was discovering the text as I was translating it, which was very interesting. I mean, just in terms of the imagery. I guess the hardest thing for me was just to try not to think and to try to just translate from the subconscious, like translate, to sort of try to channel the text more. And it's hard to describe, but I also tried to work more quickly than I usually do, because I knew that they worked quickly. So it's also a little more literal than some of my other translations. I wanted to convey the imagery. And so it's like I tried to stay more to like the literal text and just trying not to think, like just to try to, and then obviously I went over it many times afterwards, and I read biographies later. I mean,
Yeah.
I did read about them afterwards, but when I was actually translating it, I didn't want to be distracted by anything. I wanted to just work with the text itself.
Did you have any background? This is another question that kind of bridges well. Did you have any background or having read any psychoanalytic writing from the period that was sort of hovering in the background of this? Had you read that before, or did you engage with it in the process of translating?
No, but I was fascinated in the Palazzati biography about how Breton was interested in Freud before a lot of people knew about Freud. I thought that was very interesting. And also that the subjects that he had in his hospital, a lot of them were hallucinating, and they were suffering from shell shock. And he said they were like better poets than he was.
Right.
And so he wanted to sort of recreate that kind of hallucinatory poetry. I thought that was fascinating afterwards. But no, I didn't read anything while I was doing it. I just wanted to work just with the text itself.
Can you talk about the challenges of maintaining the flow and tension in a work that seems to be constantly engaging in its own digression?
It was difficult. I mean, it's not an easy text to translate. And I guess the only way that I found to do that was just to keep going as much as I could. Like I tried not to take breaks, and I just tried to immerse myself as much as I could in this. And also there is a rhythm to it. And the rhythm sort of started to carry me along after a little while. And after a little bit, you sort of start to get into the voice of the text. And that's when it actually helps not to think, because then the voice sort of takes over. And it becomes easier. Like it's always the beginning is always the hardest, because you haven't incorporated that voice yet. But the more you translate, the easier it starts to get. Except at the end, when it doesn't really make any sense, then it's hard.
Unique challenge of this text. Do you also read the French aloud to yourself before you set in to translate a line, and then read it aloud to yourself in English after you've made your word and phrase choices? If you do use this process as you go through the poem line by line, do you hear the melodic lines arise as they unspool? And if so, how does that process influence your satisfaction with the poem in its entirety once you are done? Does it begin to feel like a song?
That's a lovely question. I hear it in my head. I don't actually read it out loud as I'm translating it. I do hear the French in my head, and then I try to make it sound just as melodic in English as I'm translating it. It's not a conscious thing. I mean, I don't, later on I'll go over it, and I will try to maybe, I'm trying to think now, it's been a while since I've done it. So, I mean, I revised it a lot, but I'm not sure how, I definitely read the English aloud. Yeah, that helped a lot. And then I would change it according to how something might sound. Yeah.
A great follow-up question to this. Do you know whether or not either of the writers would perform or read this in public? I'm sorry, that jumped around. If so, are there any, sorry, Zoom is moving these questions around. If so, are there any accounts of how they performed? Were they flat in their intonation? Did they overact, accents of humor, etc.?
Edwin, do you know that?
I don't know. It's a good question and a very interesting question. Yeah, I don't know.
I read that Philippe Soupault didn't really want to have anything to do with it afterwards. I think he just sort of wanted to distance himself from it. I think it was mostly sort of Breton that took over, and he actually revised a lot of it. And and even when they met with Aragon at the end, they met him at a cafe. I think Soupault just sort of slipped away and said that he had to like buy a newspaper or something. I think he just didn't want to have anything to do with it later. So I'm not sure. I'm guessing they didn't really give readings together, but I don't know the answer to that.
It is true, though, that they immediately after, though I haven't read this, and I can't remember the title of it, I don't know about Soupault, who was a good deal less self-serious than Breton, but Breton was involved in via the Dadaists and Sarah, whom he soon fell out with, in an automatic writing theatrical piece. So there was a notion of public performance of automatic writing things but this is a separate piece, which I haven't read. But no.
Was Breton aware of Aleister Crowley's experiments in automatic writing? And wasn't he also interested in the occult in this regard?
Edwin, do you know?
I don't know whether he was involved with Crowley or aware of Crowley. I certainly, has many flaws, but Satanism was one that he seems to have mercifully escaped. Anyway. Yeah.
Fair. No, we've got some far-reaching questions here. Someone was wondering, is there any existent copy of the original manuscript? Can you see the different handwriting, how they were engaging with one another, like sort of in the play of An Exquisite Corpse?
Yes, there are. It was not that I can speak with great authority, but it is clear from the French, from the Pléiade edition, that the first sections are, I think, composed in French school books, which Breton had a particular affection for. And I don't know what they looked like at that point. Until recently, they were particularly sort of gridded and grim and constraining entities, French. But yes, there are several manuscripts, and there's a manuscript history of some of the revisions too, and which is how they are able to figure out who wrote what, though they can't entirely determine that.
I think Breton revised the one that we just read, The Barriers. I think he took a lot of stuff out because it was making too much sense. I read that somewhere, that he wanted to make less sense, so he just took some of the dialogue out. And Robert tells me that in Breton's Arcane 17, which I think is translated as Arcanum 17, I think he does talk about the occult in that. It's when he was living in Canada after World War II. What was that? During World War II. Yeah. So that's interesting.
So you did mention that your approach to this translation was starkly different than a different translations that you've done. Did you enjoy it differently? What was your subjective experience of going through it? I
enjoyed it a lot. I didn't actually mean to translate the whole book, so I sort of got hooked, and I couldn't stop just because I wanted to. And also, each section is so different. I mean, it's I don't know how they did it, but it's not like one continuous linear narrative. I mean, obviously, each section is very distinct and unique. And no, I love translating it, and it was kind of like a visceral joy.
That's how we ended up doing it. Is that you wrote and you said you'd done the first part and wanted to do the rest, and would I be interested in publishing it? And it's extraordinary to me that it hasn't been translated since David Gascoigne did it in the 30s. But
I know, I was shocked, actually. I couldn't believe that it hadn't been translated. That's why I wasn't going to do any more, because I thought it had already been done several times. And I was really happy that it was just the Gascoigne and that was out of print. So.
Well, let's take one more question. Looking to the future, what are you working on now?
I'm working on Matthias Enau's new novel, which is 440 pages long. It's called The Annual Bank. What's that?
I said, any paragraph breaks?
Oh yeah, no, it has paragraph breaks. It's actually, yeah, it's not like Zone. It's called the Annual Banquet of the Gravediggers Guild, and it's very different from all of Haenel's other novels. It's narrated by a French ethnographer, and it takes place in France. And so far, it's very straightforward. But it's going to, I think soon it's going to take a turn and start imitating Rabelais and a lot of troubadour poems and things like that. So, and then also, I just found out that I'll be translating volume 2 of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu for Oxford University Press.
Wow.
Which is a big thing for
That's
me.
great. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank
That's
you.
the fun volume.
Yeah.
Well, Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing this with us. Edwin, thank you too. The joint readings were really, really fun. And as always, these are an intense pleasure. And for everyone watching, I posted in the chat, but before I leave, I'm going to post it one more time, a link to buy tonight's book. So please click on that and go to the website and buy. It is a really tremendous work, and I'm happy as a non-French reader to be able to finally engage with it. So as always, but Charlotte, Edwin, thank you for your time. And
thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.